right as we are receiving patch 11.0.7 with what we have already talked about yesterday, the totally surprising and totally unexpected mega buffing of the ring, which would have otherwise been completely useless, there was also something very interesting that came out with the release of the patch, which was an interview with our Lord and Master Ian Costas, the game director of World of Warcraft. This one is an interesting one because the interview wasn't about patch 11.0.7, which frankly doesn't really have much, but about 11.1, the next tier, the next season of the expansion. Now, what was interesting about this interview is that it talked about the next raid, the next mindset of the developers for the next raid when talking about weak auras, when talking about the complexity of raid mechanics and what they plan to do in the next raid. Now stay with me if going through this interview will feel kind of like a deja vu that you've somewhat heard before a few times. Now, what Ion is pointing out about the next raid, the liberation of Undermine, is that he's saying we are going to go into the Grand Casino in Undermine to go off against Gallywix, and he's saying that the environmental framing is going to be part of what makes it a unique experience, something that they have been trying to lean over the past 10 years in a way that they didn't originally with the previous, earlier boomer raids. What he's referring to is practically, tying more bosses to their environment, their rooms, and things you can interact with inside the room itself. He's making the example of there's something almost cute about being able to practically teleport any boss of Molten Core into just an empty room, and you would almost notice no difference from where you used to fight them. Compare this, for example, with Senarth in Dragonflight. You needed to be in that room. You needed to be in those environments to have all the slippery room and having to go floor after floor, the slippery room, etc., etc. Even fights, for example, like Razaget. It's a platform, yes, but there are borders, there are edges, because she's trying to knock you off the platform. If you just moved Razaget into a room with walls, then the entire mechanic of kicking you off the platform is pointless. From this expansion, from this raid, you have something like Rashanan. You kind of need that kind of open, large environment to let Rashanan fly around and you having to move a long distance every time. Even on fights like Sikran, it needs to be a tight, small-ish circle because it's a fight against time as the room fills up more and more and more during that fight. And then, of course, the biggest example is Brood Twister, where the entire room fills up with eggs that you have to interact with. So if you just moved Brood Twister into an empty room, it would be practically a patchwork boss doing nothing. Now, he's also making the reference of how the raids have become more of an arms race over time, because as Blizzard is trying to develop more complicated bosses, the community is trying to answer to the complicatedness of those bosses with more add-ons, with more, in this case, weak auras that try to solve the complexity of the bosses. So Blizzard thinks they are smart, they come up with a pretty good, interesting mechanic. The players think that mechanic is too hard, so they come up with a weak aura that can deal with it. So Blizzard developers respond by making those fights even more complicated to keep things more interesting, because what they thought was going to be an interesting and cool mechanic that players would have had to wrap their brains around has been trivialized by a weak aura, by a sound and an icon telling the player go left or stop DPS. So they wrap their heads around trying to make an even more difficult mechanic so that players can wrap their heads around trying to make an even more complex weak aura to solve that mechanic. Rinse and repeat. Or alternatively, Blizzard gives up and they try to wrap their heads around trying to come up with mechanics that cannot be solved with weak auras. Things like, for example, bullet hells. A whole bunch of swirlies and lines that you have to dodge. There are no amount of weak auras that are gonna help you dodge all of the lines on Ansurek, or even all of the lines during Nexus Princess, either the normal phase or the intermission. You just have to dodge. This, of course, as we have seen in recent expansions, has caused Blizzard to experiment with making different mechanics unreadable by mods, sometimes, blocked as private auras that were not able to be read by weak auras, for example, so you just had to find other ways to deal with those mechanics. But players even try to get workarounds for those things. Remember, for example, Smolderon. They had the mechanic where a bunch of players were being chased by the orbs spawning from the portals, and you had to clear them in order but not too close to each other, otherwise you would blow up the raid. So players come up with a macro that players have to press. That macro being pressed was going to put players in a list so that the raid leader would call the players in order from that list to go and match with their orb to clear the mechanic in order without blowing up. So technically, even though it was a private aura, they still found a way to work around that. Ion himself, of course, also does confirm the outlier of this raid, which was, of course, Broad Twister Ovinax, and the complicated requirements of the weak auras for the egg-breaking mechanic of the fight, which was made even more complicated not because of the egg breaking itself, but because the boss model was huge. On top of the boss model, you also had a bunch of swirlies on the ground you had to dodge, so the visibility of the entire place was also a problem throughout the fight, plus the complex weak aura of being able to assign multiple players to different eggs in a very short period was quite the difficult task, even for weak auras. So one of the announcements we got from this interview was that as a result of all of these problems tied to weak auras and tied to the increased complexity of mechanics of bosses, is that Blizzard is now hoping to remove more functionality from weak aura raids in the future, and hopefully that is going to happen because there are going to be more in-game sources of information and more time to react as a result of it. In his own words, we will likely want to start clawing back on some functionality of weak auras as long as we can make sure that our baseline game experience is offering players the information they need to have an engaging, elegant time, verbatim. Now, as I said, why this might have felt somewhat like a deja vu, this is not. This is not the first time we have heard Blizzard announcing any kind of intention to reduce add-on bloat or even add-on importance when it came to abilities in raids. This started all the way back during the big outlier of the Archimon fight in Hellfire Citadel. So we're talking about almost a decade ago in Legion. Yeah, Legion was almost a decade ago, by the way. That was, by the way, a mechanic where 20 players would be grouped in pairs during a fight, and then a beam would spawn between each of the pair of players. So somewhat, players were able to create a weak aura that gave you a map showing the direction of all of the lines created by the players, blinking red if some players were overlapping each other's lines, because you couldn't have lines cross each other if you were getting hit by two or more of those lines at the same time. That was sort of the ultimate final tipping point that made Blizzard realize, yeah, maybe we went a bit too far with these kind of mechanics. But even since then, even since Legion, we have kept seeing these kind of difficult mechanics, this kind of weak auras requirements on complex fights, things like even Jailer, with the order in which to drop your bombs in the holes. In Dragonflight, of course, you had the combo of Farak and then Smolderon. So it is interesting to have, at this point, I guess, yet another one of these announcements of will, announcements of intention from Blizzard about wanting to reduce the amount of complex mechanics in order to replace them with more obvious mechanic, more environmentally grounded kind of mechanics. For example, the lines you have to dodge on Ansurek, the waves after the explosions you have to dodge on Ansurek, even the grips, even the pull-ins of Ansurek. These are all not mechanics that you need weak auras for. It's just, dodge or position yourself correctly without specifically needing a weak aura. Technically, even the Silken Court, for how difficult of a coordinated dance it was, it didn't necessarily need any complex weak aura to work. It was a lot of very precise movement, a lot of very precise direction you had to follow, but technically you didn't actually need some groundbreaking weak aura to deal with the fight. The other best example perhaps in the entire raid was Nexus Princess. Nexus Princess was very positionally grounded. You had to put your assassinations correctly, you had to move to aim your Queen's Bane line correctly, then you had to dodge the lines on the ground correctly, and then the balls that would spawn from the assassinated targets or the Queen's Bane targets correctly, and in the intermission it's a whole bunch of happy feet dodging, again without really that many necessary weak auras. So it is definitely interesting. After all, many players would consider Nexus Princess a pretty fun fight, especially the ones who went through the boss after it was nerfed and stopped being so brutal in the damage the few players with the dots and the debuffs would take. So it will be interesting to see if we do get to have more More Nexus Princess-like fights and less Broad Twister-like fights. So more environmentally charged bosses, more things to dodge, to stack, to spread, to run in this particular direction, rather than just something that is heavily impacted by how complex a weak aura is, because of how complex the mechanic put in the fight is going to be and requires a complex add-on to solve. We will see, of course. For now, we don't even have a PTR, so we can't even see exactly what Blizzard is planning when it comes to the boss mechanics. We will see soon, in the beginning of the next year. We will be getting the PTR of the next patch, so we will be able to start to get an idea of what the Blizzard is planning. But for now, I guess all we have left is to just be hooked up on Hopium, on what exactly is going to be coming out in 11.1. At least we have a statement of intention from the lead developer, just so we can go back at it and complain about being a lie if it turns out to be completely wrong. So for today, this is what we have related to the incoming 11.1 at this point, after the actual release of 11.0.7, our next incoming patch. So for today, on this Wednesday, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone who is supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys, tomorrow. And in the meantime, I don't know why every time we get close to Christmas, I just expect it to snow. I don't want it to snow for like the entire week, just for a couple of days to keep the snow up by the time Christmas comes.